Welcome all speakers, journalists, supporters, and members of the public to this press conference in support of ending fossil fuel subsidies in the state of New York. Thank you all so much for joining us. We really appreciate everyone attending this conference. And today you'll be hearing from about 5 speakers from across New York State who will speak for about 2 to 3 minutes each. Following the speakers' short remarks, there will be a short Q&A for journalists. During the Q&A at the end, journalists, if you have a question for our panelists, please raise your hand using the raise hand button found by clicking the participants button at the bottom of your screen. Your audio and video will be turned on so you can ask your question live to our panelists. Before you ask your question, if you can just state your name and outlet before asking your question, that would be great. And just a reminder for journalists that this conference will be recorded. So when your video and audio is turned on, just keep that in mind. The chat is also disabled for this conference. So if you have any issues, please email us afterwards. And with that, we can get started. So again, this conference is in support of ending fossil fuel subsidies in New York State. And my name is Radesh Singh. I serve as the executive director of the New York Youth Climate Leaders, which is a youth-led organization dedicated to advocating for economic and environmental justice for New Yorkers across the state. We adamantly support Assembly Bill A257C, a bill that would require the governor to publicly disclose all fossil fuel tax expenditures and installs a sunset date 5 years from the passage of this bill for these subsidies, except on a case-by-case basis for those that the state legislature deems essential. And with that, today we are releasing a letter, a sign-on letter, consisting of over 180 organizations from across the state to Assembly leadership, as well as the governor, encouraging them to pass this bill in the Assembly and the governor to sign this bill, so we can take the next step in combating the climate crisis right here in New York State. And without further ado, I will hand it on to our first speaker, Liam Smith, who serves as the co-director of government affairs for the New York Youth Climate Leaders and is a current freshman at Middlebury College. Liam, I'll pass it on to you.
Thanks, Radesh, and good morning, everyone. As a freshman in college, I'm concerned about climate change, quite frankly, because I'm concerned about my future. As the global average temperature increases over time, the issues associated with climate change will increase in severity. It will take time for our climate to heat up, so much time that our current politicians will probably not be alive to witness the worst ramifications. However, my generation and future generations will be alive. We will endure the effects of a chaotic and rapidly changing climate. We will be subject to drought, famine, increasingly severe storms and wildfires, worse air pollution, increased prevalence of insect-borne diseases, coastal flooding, climate refugee crises, potentially wars over dwindling resources, and much, much more. The COVID-19 pandemic has only exacerbated the issues facing our generation, fracturing our economy, leaving tens of millions unemployed, and opening up gaping holes in our state budget. Our climate is in crisis and our economy is in free fall. Now more than ever, we need to be careful where we're putting our resources. And yet, every year, New York State spends over $1.5 billion worth of tax expenditures subsidizing the fossil fuel industry. Our letter reads the following. In the middle of an unprecedented fiscal shortfall, unnecessary subsidies are harmful to the people of New York State. While some subsidies are necessary to the health of the New York economy, subsidizing industries that damage our future and climate is fiscally and morally irresponsible. When draconian cuts are being made to essential public services such as Medicaid and education, spending more than $1.5 billion every year on the fossil fuel industry is an outrageous and unconscionable waste of money. That money could be better used to help cover the budget shortfalls New York State is experiencing in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic. Spending hard-earned tax dollars on these unnecessary subsidies will cause people to miss out on the basic services that they rely on every day. Bill A257C requires the governor to disclose all fossil fuel-related tax expenditures and installs a sunset date 5 years after passage for these subsidies. The bill also creates a process through which the legislature can exempt any expenditures they deem essential on a case-by-case basis. It passed in the State Senate in August, and it currently sits in the Government Operations Committee of the State Assembly. The onus is on the chair of that committee, Assemblyman Zebrowski, as well as Speaker Hasty, to move this bill forward when session resumes. Through our sign-on letter, 180 organizations are calling on Speaker Hasty and Chairman Zabrowski to prioritize this legislation when session does resume. Eliminating fossil fuel subsidies is critical in the fight to stop climate change, and it is important now more than ever that we take action on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liam. Now we're going to be hearing from Ruth Foster of the Divest New York Coalition. Ruth Foster is a lifelong activist fighting nuclear power and apartheid in the 1980s. She worked for 15 years on children's mental health policy in Albany and has been a climate activist since 2015, fighting pipelines in her community and now working for divestment from fossil fuels. Ruth?
Hi, thank you, Radesh, and thank you for inviting me to speak. As Radesh said, I'm with the Divest New York Coalition, and we are a coalition of dozens of grassroots and statewide organizations working to get Comptroller DiNapoli to divest the New York State Common Retirement Fund from fossil fuels. First, we fought to get New York City's pension to divest, and we won that fight, and we're hoping to win this statewide fight as well. And we are also currently focusing on getting the teachers' pension funds to divest. We fully support passage of this legislation to stop taxpayer subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. And I want to thank the New York Youth Climate Leaders for their leadership on this issue. And I want to thank Senator Krueger for all her work on all her climate issues, divestment and tax subsidies. The climate crisis is upon us. And as California burns, the Gulf Coast is underwater, and September was the hottest September on record. We know that we must do everything in our power to protect our climate, and we must do it now. It's an urgent crisis. Yet New York continues to fund the fossil fuel industry, the cause of all this destruction. And all this despite New York's new landmark law that requires a 50% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in just 10 years. With New York's climate law, we must be taken seriously, and that means that the fossil fuel industry's days are numbered. Why on earth would we use taxpayer dollars to prop up a dying and destructive industry? It just makes no sense. New York must use all our resources to build our new economy, one that is a new energy future based on a transformation to clean renewable energy, such as wind, solar energy. What Divest New York has taught me is that grassroots groups can make a difference. We can help to transform our economy to one that builds a future for the young people of New York and for all New Yorkers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruth, for your remarks and all your work. Next, we'll be hearing from Elizabeth Moran, who serves as the Environmental Policy Director for the New York Public Interest Research Group, or NYPIRG. Elizabeth?
Hi, thanks so much. Thank you everyone for coming this morning. My name's Liz Moran. I'm the Environmental Policy Director for NYPIRG, the New York Public Interest Research Group. I'd like to begin by thanking the New York Youth Climate Leaders for their tireless work on climate change, on making polluters pay, and of course, organizing this fantastic letter that demonstrates broad support for this issue and organizing this news conference today. After decades of lies from the fossil fuel industry, our world finds itself in a perilous place between the COVID pandemic and the worsening climate crisis, which has only been highlighted by the COVID pandemic. Environmental justice communities, which have already suffered from poor air quality, are more at risk from the COVID pandemic. New York State is home to one of the communities with the highest asthma rates in the country. We have raging wildfires out west, which is only now a recurring pattern that is likely to continue. We have an unprecedented number of hurricanes this year. But thankfully, New York State has taken some very important steps to fight climate change by adopting these ambitious climate goals. But in order to meet those climate goals, we have to make sure that we are funding to fight the climate crisis, to fight a just transition off of fossil fuels, and to make sure that we restore the environment to what it once was and protect the public health of New Yorkers. So as New York faces a fiscal cliff and the climate crisis has only gotten worse, we have to make sure that polluters are the ones that pay, not the average New Yorker. not taxpayers. It should be polluters that are held accountable for their decades of lies and delaying climate action for decades and putting us in the place we are now in. Thankfully, New York State has a great history of making polluters pay. We have the Superfund law on the books, for example. So now it's up to New York to keep that up. We have to do this, and one of the simplest way to do it is by ending the fossil fuel subsidies we give to this antiquated industry of the past. So I'd like to thank Senator Krueger and Assemblyman Cahill for carrying this legislation. Thank you, Senator Krueger, for shepherding this through the Senate. And so we're here joining everyone today to call on the State Assembly to pass this legislation and for the governor to sign it into law as soon as possible. So that way New York State has taken this next step to hold polluters accountable and to fund our way out of the climate crisis. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Liz, so much. We really appreciate it. Next, we're going to hear from Connor Bembrick, who serves as the Director of Climate Policy for Environmental Advocates New York. Connor?
Hi, good morning. Thank you, Radesh, and thank you to the New York Youth Climate Leaders for organizing this letter and this news conference. And thank you to Senator Krueger for carrying such a thoughtful and good piece of legislation. New York's climate law, as been mentioned earlier, requires the state to essentially move off of fossil fuels in the next 30 years. And, in doing so, we have to make sure that the state is aligning all of its policies with that climate law. This includes not only our emissions reductions goals and our renewable energy goals, but also the equity mandates throughout the law that requires the state to prioritize action in environmental justice in frontline communities to help them transition to this new economy. And these policies include our antiquated tax policies. This very thoughtful bill will take a hard look at all the various exemptions out there, like sales tax exemptions for heating fuels, or the tax cap on gasoline that's currently in place. Exemptions and caps that are currently costing the state hundreds of millions of dollars. And this legislation will require the governor to make thoughtful decisions on which of these exemptions should be retired or sunsetted, and which ones may need to stay in place for a little while longer while we figure out how to end them equitably, to make sure our lower income households throughout the states aren't suffering disproportionately for policies that have just been in place way too long. Especially in times of fiscal stress, like we're seeing right now, instead of limiting investments in climate and clean energy funds, as the state has been tempted to do in the past, rating our climate funds through the regional greenhouse gas initiatives, we should instead look to the hundreds of millions of dollars we're currently dedicating to incentivize the use of fossil fuels and dedicate those savings to even more investments in climate and clean energy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Connor. Finally, we're going to be hearing from New York State Senator Liz Krueger, who serves as the chair of the Senate Finance Committee and is the lead sponsor of S2649C, the Senate counterpart to A257C. Senator Krueger?
Thank you. Thank you all for being here today. I want to thank all of these incredible environmental activists for the work that they do every day. I'm not sure that I could imagine as a freshman in college that I would be orchestrating a statewide movement around the environment. So extra kudos out to the youth leaders who have brought us here today. So I think everyone pretty much said what I wanted to say, but I want to emphasize something that reporters and the public may not understand. We're talking about $1.5 billion of expenditures in our tax policies that we have written into law over decades with no one ever even looking at them again twice, where we are actually saying we want to incentivize certain activities, so we're going to give you tax deductions. Why in the 21st century would anyone imagine it's a good idea to incentivize, give an extra push to use fossil fuels? That is just completely counterintuitive to everything we're trying to do in environmental policy. So no, ending subsidies won't end all use of fossil fuels, but why the heck would we use our taxpayer dollars to incentivize their use in the 21st century? And yes, it is critical to understand that we are desperate for tax revenue in New York State. So the fact that we have billions and billions and billions of dollars going out as tax incentives with no one ever even asking the question and looking at them, they just keep going on year after year. I believe there's over 30 billion in tax incentives built into our tax code. We're starting with petroleum products and fossil fuel products because when we were attempting to review and challenge all of them, it just stuck out like a sore thumb. Oh my goodness, why would we be incentivizing fossil fuels? How can this even be a category that New York State is incentivizing? So I'm thrilled that this is the duality in this bill of my longer term goals of having every tax incentive looked at and evaluated by the legislature and the governor. Some are justified. Some might have been justified in 1975, but are not now in the 21st century. And we would bring money back into the state budget with no new taxes if we could really get our arms around these tax incentives that have exploded beyond what anybody ever imagined. And the obvious place to start is with those that are actually encouraging environmental damage. So I'm very happy that I was able to move it through the Senate. Kevin Cahill is my lead sponsor in the Assembly, and he's been a terrific partner. And I know he wanted to get it done, but of course, the pandemic, the economic collapse, everyone sort of not being together in the same city has had a real impact on our legislative schedule. So what I hope this press conference and this movement by organizations through letters to the Assembly and the governor will do, it will jumpstart this bill the next time the Assembly is in session, and it will give a heads up to the governor that this is coming to his desk to be signed into law. And that is a win-win for the state of New York. And again, as was explained, if there are exemptions that need to be made, if there is a slower process that needs to be used for certain kinds of exemptions for certain reasons, all of that can be handled through the process that the bill has set up. But it is absolutely, in my opinion, crucial that New York State start this process now. And then, while I might get joined by other advocates from other communities, that we continue my goals of having objective evaluations of every tax exemption and expenditure in the tax code. Because remember, when someone doesn't pay their taxes, somebody else is making up for it. So it's the duality of who's paying and who's not as well. So thank you all so much for having me join you today.
Thank you so much, Senator. Now we're going to be transitioning into our short Q&A for our panelists. So members of the media, if you have a question, please use the raise hand button and your voice and video will be turned on so you can ask your question live. Again, the raise hand button is on the bottom of your screen by clicking the participants button, which is again on the center of your bottom of your screen. And before you ask your question, if you can please state your name and outlet before asking your question, that would be wonderful.
Can I go right ahead?
Yes, you can, Sarah.
Hi, Sarah Darmanjian from News 10 out of Albany. I'm curious to know what the 1.5 million in subsidies is used for. Does the state have restrictions on the types of activities that the money can be used for? And maybe this would be better for Senator Krueger.
Okay. So it's 1.5 billion, Sarah, not million, just to emphasize how big a pot of money we're talking about. And there's a series of individual tax expenditures that were written into the tax code over the last 50 years. So if you're doing that kind of business activity, then you get to take that tax deduction from your tax filings. You don't have to apply for it. We don't get the right to say yes or no to you. The existence of that expenditure item in the tax code allows you to not have to pay that portion of your taxes on your tax documents. So there's no process where we take a look and go, yeah, not that one. No, not this person over here. No, not that company over there. It's just a quote unquote as of right tax expenditure if it's on our books.
And how old are some of these provisions in the tax code?
So I don't have my tax code in front of me. I apologize. I should have done that this morning. But if you go onto the Tax and Finance website and you look for the tax expenditure report, that's what it's called, the tax expenditure report, you can open it up, look at every single tax expenditure in the state of New York, and it will give you a little paragraph on what it is and the date it became law. And all of the petroleum, fossil fuel tax expenditures are in one chapter.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Next, we have Marie French.
Hey guys, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, just a quick question for the senator. You mentioned sort of, maybe there are some exemptions that would still need to be made. I think, the NYLCV and CBC had a report on some of the fossil fuel exemptions, including for residential heating and for, motor vehicle fuel. Are those the type of exemptions you're thinking of, the type that hit, the average consumer, or, what do you think might need to be looked at in that area?
Well, I certainly think one that we would be looking at is the home heating oil, because the fact is that there are many low-income New Yorkers who live in places where they neither have the money to retrofit their heating system, or they don't own the building. They may be just renters, so they wouldn't control it. I'm hoping that in the course of the evaluation that would take place, we would also recognize that there might be far better tax exemptions than incentivizing home heating fuel, and that we would instead be exploring green incentives that would encourage building owners to convert off of fossil fuels to other cleaner forms of energy and heat, where individual people who are homeowners might have a mechanism to be incentivized to retrofit their homes at a reasonable cost with the help of the state of New York, that it would be made clear that this wouldn't apply to, even if we were scaling it down over time, it would be triggered by the income level of the household, and also would be clear that you cannot build new housing using fossil fuels and expect this incentive. So I think there are a variety of ways to approach perhaps even the most complicated question there.
Thank you. Do you have any other follow-up questions? Okay, great. Yeah, if any other members of the media has a question, feel free to use the raise hands button on the bottom of your screen. And again, we can pose those to our panelists here.
Hey, just one follow-up on that. Sorry, I had some trouble with the mute button. Senator, you mentioned sort of obviously the home heating, which is a big deal, but what about the cap on the motor vehicle fuel tax?
Okay, so
That's a pretty big one according to the report.
that's a big one, and that's a real political one. Just want to remind everybody that was created uniquely in New York at a time when the Senate Republicans were trying desperately to come up with a new additional win from a political perspective. And it was at a time where automobile gasoline taxes were automobile gas costs were going up at a very rapid rate. And I think we were at around the $4 per gallon level. And so the theory was that we would cap how much we could charge on a gallon of gas for sales tax. Well, a couple of things happened there. One, that does encourage more driving, but what it really did was just take away a revenue stream from the state of New York that was being used to repair roads and bridges, because our gas taxes in New York State go towards making sure that we keep our roads and bridges functioning. So we put that cap on. What it seems to have done is clearly decrease the amount of money that we're sending into the funding stream for repairs of roads and bridges, which has caused real problems for people who live outside big cities and need roads and bridges to get from point A to point B. So as a public policy question, a cap on the percentage of a sales tax on gasoline beyond a certain level as prices go up or down is a really bad public policy answer, even if you want to help people with lower gasoline costs. And I'm not sure it's a public policy question. We do want to continue to help people with gasoline tax costs. We want to incentivize them to drive vehicles that use less gas, or perhaps even no gas at the stage we are at. And we want to ask hard questions about where is the revenue coming from that is supposed to go to keep maintaining our roads and bridges, because clearly we will still need them. And right now we are facing an enormous problem with the lack of dedicated revenue streams for those things when we need them. So I'm really excited to have that hard discussion about that gas cap tax, how we got there, does it make sense, and is it creating even bigger problems for us?
Thank you.
Thank you, Marie. Next is Sarah with a follow-up question.
Hi, yes, thank you. Just wondering if there has been research done regarding other states' subsidies for fossil fuels. Like, for example, I know that California has passed some of the most progressive environmental laws. Have they cut back on their subsidies, or is there another state that has done that? I'm just curious what the outcome was.
This is a stump me. I'm hoping one of the environmental groups has done state by state analysis, but I have not, so I'm sorry, I don't know the answer.
Yeah, I'm not aware of other states and their efforts on fossil fuel subsidies either. However, I'd be happy to follow up with you if any of our partners or my colleagues know the answer to this.
That'd be great, thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. And yeah, we'll definitely follow up with you with that answer to your question. Great. If anyone, other members of the media have a question, feel free to use the raise hands button found at the bottom of your screen. Seeing none, we'd just like to once again thank everyone for attending this conference, as well as our panelists, and for all their work on this issue. We really appreciate everyone being able to take the time out of their morning to come to this conference in support of ending fossil fuel subsidies in the state of New York. After all, it is our future and future generations to come that are at stake here, as we must make sure that our generation and future generations have a livable planet to inherit. So thank you all so much for coming. We appreciate your support, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.